Captain James Mitchell stepped off the military transport plane at RAF Bryce Norton, his boots hitting British soil for the first time. The crisp autumn air of Oxfordshire filled his lungs as he adjusted his dress uniform and straightened his shoulders. At 28 years old, Mitchell had already earned a reputation as one of the most decorated officers in his battalion. His chest displayed ribbons from 2 tours in Afghanistan, a Purple Heart, and commendations for leadership under fire. The invitation to participate in the joint military exercises between American and British forces was an honor he had worked years to achieve. Mitchell had always prided himself on being the best soldier in any room. His physical fitness scores were legendary, his marksmanship was unmatched, and his leadership had saved countless lives during combat operations. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never met a challenge he couldn't conquer. As the bus transported him and his fellow American officers toward London, Mitchell gazed out at the countryside with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. He had heard stories about the British military, their traditions, and their famous ceremonial guards. While he respected their history, he couldn't help but wonder if their modern military could match the intensity and effectiveness of American forces. "You excited about seeing the Queen's Guard?" asked Lieutenant Sarah Chen, sitting across from him. She was one of the few officers Mitchell genuinely respected, having served alongside her in Kandahar. Mitchell shrugged. "I suppose it'll be interesting to see the tourist attraction up close. Though I'm more interested in the actual military training we'll be doing." The comment drew chuckles from several nearby officers, but Chen raised an eyebrow. "You might want to keep an open mind, James. These guys have been doing this for centuries. There might be something to learn." "I'm sure they're fine for parades and photo opportunities," Mitchell replied, his voice carrying the casual dismissiveness that had become his trademark when discussing anything he hadn't personally mastered. "But real military discipline comes from real combat experience, not marching around in funny hats." The bus wound through London's busy streets, past iconic landmarks that Mitchell had only seen in movies. Big Ben, the Thames, Westminster Abbey. All impressive in their own right, but his mind was focused on the upcoming exercises. He had spent weeks preparing, studying British military protocols and practicing with equipment he might encounter. When they finally arrived at their temporary quarters near Wellington Barracks, Mitchell was struck by the sense of history that seemed to permeate every stone. The buildings had witnessed centuries of military tradition, from the Napoleonic Wars to both World Wars, from colonial conflicts to modern peacekeeping missions. Yet rather than feeling humbled by this legacy, Mitchell found himself more determined to prove that American military excellence could stand alongside any tradition. That evening, during the welcome briefing, Colonel Harrison, the American liaison officer, addressed the group. "Gentlemen and ladies, you're here representing the finest military in the world. But remember, our British counterparts have their own proud traditions and considerable expertise. Show them respect, learn from them, and demonstrate the professionalism. That makes the American military great." Mitchell nodded along with the others, but privately, he was already planning how he would distinguish himself during the exercises. He had reviewed the schedules and noted that they would have opportunities to observe various British units, including the Household Division, responsible for guarding the royal palaces. After the briefing, several officers gathered in the common room to discuss their expectations. Mitchell found himself holding court, regaling the group with stories from his combat tours and his theories about what made an effective military force. "The thing about ceremonial units," he explained, gesturing with his coffee cup, "is that they're more about show than substance. Sure, they look impressive, but when it comes to real military skills, tactical thinking, adaptability, actual fighting capability, that comes from real experience in real conflicts." Lieutenant Chen, who had been quietly reading in the corner, looked up. "Have you actually researched the Guards regiments, James? Their combat history?" Mitchell waved dismissively. "I know they've been in some conflicts, but standing motionless for hours and looking pretty for tourists isn't exactly combat training. These ceremonial guards are probably selected more for their height and ability to stand still than their actual military capabilities. The conversation continued late into the evening, with Mitchell growing more confident in his assessments. He had built his career on being the best, on pushing himself and his men to exceed every standard. The idea that soldiers who spent their time in elaborate uniforms performing ceremonies could match his level of training seemed unlikely. As he lay in his narrow military cot that night, Mitchell stared at the ceiling and planned his approach to the coming weeks. He would be respectful, of course. He wasn't arrogant enough to be openly dismissive. But he was confident that when the actual training began, the differences in preparation and capability would become apparent. The next morning brought their first official tour of London's military sites. As their group approached Buckingham Palace, Mitchell could see the famous red-coated guards in their distinctive bearskin hats standing at attention outside the gates. Tourists clustered around the railings, taking photographs and trying to provoke reactions from the motionless soldiers. "Impressive discipline," commented Major Rodriguez, one of Mitchell's colleagues. Mitchell nodded, but his expression was analytical rather than admiring. "It's certainly disciplined, but it's a very specific type of discipline. Standing perfectly still is one skill set. Adapting to rapidly changing combat situations is another entirely." As they watched the changing of the guard ceremony, Mitchell found himself studying the precise movements, the perfect synchronization, the obvious hours of practice that went into every step and gesture. It was undeniably impressive as a display, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it represented a kind of military performance rather than military preparedness. What Mitchell didn't realize was that among the tourists and casual observers, several off-duty members of various guards regiments were also watching, having noticed the group of American officers. Word had already begun to spread through informal channels about the confident American captain who had some interesting opinions about ceremonial duties versus real military effectiveness. The stage was being set for an encounter that would challenge everything Mitchell thought he knew about discipline, tradition, and what it truly meant to be a soldier. The opportunity Mitchell had been unconsciously waiting for arrived 3 days later during a joint training session at the Guards Depot in Caterham. The American officers were observing British training methods, rotating through different demonstrations, designed to showcase the breadth of skills maintained by various regiments. Mitchell watched with professional interest as British soldiers demonstrated urban combat techniques, weapons maintenance, and tactical communications. He had to admit that their technical proficiency was solid, though he noted several areas where he felt American methods were superior. Throughout the morning, he offered quiet observations to his fellow American officers, pointing out differences in approach and technique. It was during the lunch break that Mitchell first encountered Guardsman William Thompson of the Grenadier Guards. Thompson was 26 years old, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, with the ramrod posture and measured movements characteristic of the household division. What Mitchell couldn't see from Thompson's composed exterior was a combat veteran of 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, and 1 in the Balkans, a man who had earned the Military Cross for gallantry and whose ceremonial duties were just one aspect of his military service. The meeting occurred in the dining hall, where American and British personnel were sharing tables and engaging in informal conversations. Mitchell found himself seated across from Thompson, who was still wearing his combat fatigues from the morning's training exercises. "So, you're one of the palace guards," Mitchell said, intending to break the ice with friendly conversation. "That must be interesting work." Thompson's response was polite but measured. "I serve with the Grenadier Guards, sir. Palace duties are one part of our responsibilities." Mitchell leaned back in his chair, his casual posture contrasting with Thompson's upright bearing. "I've been wondering about that. How do you balance the ceremonial stuff with actual military training? Seems like spending so much time learning parade movements and standing perfectly still might take away from other skills." Several British soldiers at nearby tables began to pay attention to the conversation, though they continued eating and maintained their composure. Thompson's expression remained neutral, but there was something in his eyes that Mitchell missed entirely. "The ceremonial duties require considerable discipline and precision," Thompson replied. "But they're part of a broader training regimen that includes all aspects of military service." Mitchell nodded, warming to the subject. "Oh, I'm sure it takes discipline. I just mean that there's a difference between parade discipline and combat discipline, you know? Like standing motionless for 2 hours is one thing, but adapting to enemy fire and making split-second tactical decisions is something else entirely." The dining hall had grown quieter, though Mitchell was too focused on making his point to notice. He was genuinely trying to engage in professional discussion, not realizing that his words were being interpreted quite differently by his audience. Thompson set down his fork and looked directly at Mitchell. "With respect, Captain, discipline is discipline. The mental strength required to maintain perfect composure under any circumstances, whether facing enemy fire or maintaining ceremonial duties while protesters shout inches from your face, draws from the same source." Mitchell smiled, the expression of a man who felt he was winning a friendly debate. "I can see the argument, but there's got to be a practical difference. I mean, no disrespect, but when you're standing outside Buckingham Palace, the biggest challenge is probably tourists trying to make you laugh or move. In actual combat, you're making life and death decisions under extreme stress with incomplete information." The silence in the dining hall was now noticeable, but Mitchell was too engaged in articulating his position to pay attention. Thompson's fellow guardsmen were watching with the still attention of professional soldiers, their expressions unreadable. Thompson's voice remained level, but there was steel beneath the courtesy. "Captain, might I ask about your combat experience?" Mitchell straightened, pride evident in his voice. "2 tours in Afghanistan, multiple combat operations, decorated for actions under fire. I've led men through some pretty intense situations." "I see," Thompson said quietly. "And you believe this gives you insight into different types of discipline and their relative value?" "I think it gives me insight into what real military pressure looks like," Mitchell replied, still not sensing the shift in atmosphere around him. "Don't get me wrong, I'm sure what you do takes training and commitment, but there's a difference between performing for tourists and performing when people's lives depend on your decisions." Lieutenant Chen, who had been sitting 2 tables away, was making subtle gestures trying to catch Mitchell's attention, but he was too focused on the conversation to notice. She could see what he couldn't, that every British soldier in the vicinity was now listening with the focused attention of men who were hearing something that required a response. Thompson stood slowly, his movement precise and controlled. "Captain Mitchell, would you be interested in a practical demonstration of different types of discipline?" Mitchell looked up, confused by the formal tone that had entered Thompson's voice. "What kind of demonstration?" "A simple test," Thompson replied. "Since you're interested in comparing ceremonial discipline with combat discipline, perhaps we could arrange a small exercise. Nothing elaborate, just an opportunity for you to experience both types of training directly." Mitchell's competitive instincts immediately activated. This was exactly the kind of challenge he had been hoping for, an opportunity to demonstrate American military excellence. "That sounds interesting. What did you have in mind?" Thompson's expression remained neutral, but there was something in his bearing that suggested Mitchell had just stepped into deeper waters than he realized. "With your permission, sir, and that of your commanding officer, I'd like to invite you to spend a day with my unit. You could observe our training methods firsthand, perhaps participate in some exercises, get a better understanding of what we actually do." The offer sounded perfectly reasonable to Mitchell, even generous. Here was a British soldier offering to show him the inner workings of their system, to let him see for himself how their training compared to American methods. It was exactly the kind of cross-cultural military exchange that the joint exercises were supposed to promote. "I'd be very interested in that," Mitchell replied, extending his hand to shake Thompson's. "When were you thinking?" "I'll need to make some arrangements with my superiors. Thompson said, accepting the handshake with a grip that was firm without being challenging. But perhaps we could arrange something for tomorrow morning. Would 0500 hours be convenient? Mitchell grinned. 0500 works fine for me. I'm an early riser. As Thompson nodded and began to clear his lunch tray, Mitchell turned back to his fellow American officers, satisfied that he had just arranged exactly the kind of learning opportunity that would make his report back home particularly interesting. He had no idea that Thompson was already mentally composing a very different kind of report, one that would travel through household division channels and result in a day of training that Mitchell would never forget. The dining hall gradually returned to normal conversation levels, but the British soldiers present would spend the rest of the afternoon spreading word about tomorrow's demonstration. Captain James Mitchell, decorated combat veteran and confident representative of American military excellence, was about to discover that there were aspects of discipline he had never imagined. Mitchell arrived at Wellington Barracks at 0455 hours, 5 minutes early as was his habit. The morning was cold and damp, typical London weather that reminded him why he preferred the dry heat of Afghanistan to the perpetual humidity of England. He wore his standard military fatigues and running shoes, prepared for whatever physical challenges Thompson might have arranged. What he found waiting for him was not what he had expected. Instead of Thompson alone, there were 6 members of the Grenadier Guards, all in immaculate dress uniforms, standing in perfect formation in the courtyard. Their bearskin hats added height to already tall men, making them appear like monuments to military precision. Thompson stepped forward from the group, his movements so controlled they seemed almost mechanical. "Good morning, Captain Mitchell. Thank you for accepting our invitation." Mitchell looked around the courtyard, noting the early hour and the formal atmosphere. "Morning, Thompson. Quite a welcoming committee you've got here." "These are some of my colleagues," Thompson replied, his voice carrying a formality that hadn't been present during their lunch conversation. "Guardsmen Edwards, Davies, Sullivan, Morrison, and Sergeant Phillips. They've volunteered to assist with today's demonstration." Each man acknowledged the introduction with a slight nod, their expressions neutral but attentive. Mitchell found their silence and stillness slightly unnerving, though he attributed it to British reserve rather than anything more significant. "So what exactly are we doing today?" Mitchell asked, maintaining his casual tone despite the formal reception. Thompson's response was measured and precise. "You expressed interest in understanding the relationship between ceremonial discipline and combat effectiveness. We've arranged a series of exercises that will demonstrate both. With your permission, we'll begin with some basic ceremonial drill, then progress to more complex challenges." Mitchell nodded eagerly. "Sounds good. I'm always interested in learning new techniques." What followed was Mitchell's introduction to drill that was unlike anything in his experience. Thompson and his colleagues demonstrated movements that were precise to the inch, timing that was synchronized to the split second, and a level of coordination that seemed almost inhuman. Every step, every turn, every gesture was executed with mechanical perfection. "Impressive," Mitchell admitted after watching a particularly complex sequence of movements. "How long does it take to learn all this?" "For basic proficiency, approximately 6 months of daily practice," Thompson replied. "For the level you're observing, several years of continuous refinement." Mitchell was genuinely surprised by the time commitment. "Several years? For parade movements?" Thompson's expression didn't change, but there was something in his voice that suggested Mitchell should pay closer attention to what he was seeing. "Captain, would you be willing to attempt some of these movements yourself?" The challenge was exactly what Mitchell had been hoping for. "Absolutely, show me what to do." What followed was the most humbling hour of Mitchell's military career. Movements that appeared simple when performed by the guards proved to be extraordinarily difficult to execute with any degree of precision. The timing was critical, the positioning exact, and the physical control required was far beyond what Mitchell had anticipated. After 30 minutes of attempting to master a basic marching sequence, Mitchell was sweating despite the cool morning air. His movements, which he had thought were reasonably precise, looked clumsy and uncoordinated compared to the guards' demonstration. "This is more challenging than it looks," Mitchell admitted, breathing heavily. Thompson nodded seriously. "Physical precision of this level requires complete mental focus and body control. There's no room for approximation or good enough. Every movement must be exact, every time, regardless of external conditions." Mitchell wiped sweat from his forehead and looked at the guards, who remained perfectly composed despite having been drilling for over an hour. "Okay, I can see this takes real skill. But how does this translate to actual military effectiveness?" Thompson's answer came in the form of action rather than words. "Sergeant Phillips, would you prepare the scenario training area?" Phillips nodded and disappeared into one of the buildings. Thompson turned back to Mitchell with an expression that was still polite but had gained a new intensity. "Captain, you mentioned that real military discipline comes from combat experience. Would you be willing to participate in a tactical exercise?" Mitchell's confidence returned immediately. This was his element, the area where his training and experience gave him clear advantages. "Now you're talking. What kind of tactical scenario?" "Urban combat simulation," Thompson replied. "Close quarters, multiple objectives, time pressure, incomplete information. The kind of situation that tests adaptability and decision-making under stress." Mitchell grinned. "I've done plenty of urban combat training, both simulated and real." What he walked into was a scenario more complex and demanding than anything he had encountered in American military training. The urban combat course was a maze of rooms, corridors, and obstacles that could be reconfigured to create different tactical challenges. But the real challenge wasn't the physical layout. It was the mental pressure. Thompson and his team had created a scenario that required not just tactical proficiency, but the kind of precise mental discipline they had just demonstrated on the parade ground. Every decision had to be made with incomplete information. Every movement had to be coordinated with team members using minimal communication, and every action had consequences that affected subsequent stages of the exercise. Mitchell found himself struggling in ways he hadn't expected. The guards moved through the scenario with the same mechanical precision they had shown during drill, but applied to tactical situations. Their communication was minimal but perfectly efficient, their movements coordinated without apparent effort, their decision-making calm and methodical even under artificial time pressure. Mitchell's approach, which relied heavily on aggressive leadership and rapid adaptation, began to create problems for team coordination. His tendency to modify plans on the fly, which had served him well in actual combat, disrupted the precise timing that the scenario required. After the first run-through, which had gone poorly by any measure, Thompson called for a brief break. Mitchell found himself breathing hard and feeling frustrated in a way that was entirely unfamiliar. "That was different," Mitchell admitted, trying to maintain his composure. Thompson's expression remained neutral, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was seeing exactly what he had expected to see. "The scenario requires a different type of discipline than traditional combat training. Would you like to discuss what happened?" Mitchell nodded, genuinely interested in understanding where things had gone wrong. "I felt like I was making good, tactical decisions, but somehow they weren't translating into effective team performance." "Individual tactical competence is essential," Thompson agreed, "but this exercise requires something more. It requires the ability to subordinate individual initiative to collective precision. Every team member must execute their role with exact timing and positioning, regardless of what they might individually prefer to do." The explanation struck Mitchell strangely. "So you're saying that being too adaptable can be a problem?" Thompson considered the question carefully. I'm saying that there are situations where perfect execution of a predetermined plan is more effective than creative adaptation, where individual excellence must be channeled through collective discipline. As Mitchell prepared for the second run-through of the exercise, he began to realize that what he was experiencing wasn't just a different training method, it was a fundamentally different philosophy of what military excellence meant. The guards weren't just better at ceremonial drill. They had developed a type of mental and physical discipline that allowed them to function as a perfectly coordinated unit under any circumstances. The second attempt went somewhat better, but Mitchell still found himself fighting against instincts that had served him well in other contexts. The experience was beginning to teach him something he had never considered, that there might be types of military effectiveness he had never encountered, and forms of discipline that went far beyond anything he had previously imagined. By midday, Mitchell was beginning to understand that he had walked into something far more serious than a friendly demonstration. The guards had moved from basic exercises to increasingly complex challenges, each one designed to test different aspects of discipline and mental control. What had started as Mitchell's confident assessment of ceremonial soldiers was evolving into a profound lesson about the nature of military excellence. The turning point came during what Thompson called the endurance discipline test. Mitchell expected some form of physical fitness challenge, perhaps a long march or obstacle course that would favor his excellent conditioning and combat experience. Instead, he found himself standing in a small courtyard with the 6 guards, all in full-dress uniform despite the warming afternoon. "This exercise is quite simple, Captain," Thompson explained, his voice maintaining the same measured tone he had used all morning. "We will stand at attention for 2 hours. No movement, no conversation, no acknowledgement of external distractions. Complete stillness and mental focus." Mitchell looked around the courtyard, noting the absence of any obvious challenges or obstacles. "That's it? Just stand still?" "That's it," Thompson confirmed. "Though I should mention that we've arranged for some realistic distractions that you might encounter during actual ceremonial duties." Mitchell shrugged, confident that his military discipline was more than adequate for standing still. "I've done plenty of guard duty. 2 hours should be no problem." What Mitchell couldn't see was the carefully orchestrated plan that Thompson and his colleagues had developed. Word of the American Captain's Challenge had spread through the household division, and volunteers had been recruited to provide the kind of realistic distractions that the guards faced during actual palace duties. The exercise began simply. Enough. Mitchell took his position alongside the guards and assumed what he considered a proper attention stance. For the first 15 minutes, everything was quiet and manageable. Mitchell found his mind wandering to various topics: his upcoming report, plans for evening dinner, analysis of the morning's tactical exercises. Then the distractions began. The first group of tourists arrived with cameras and began taking photographs from various angles, making comments about the uniforms and speculating about the soldiers' backgrounds. Mitchell found this mildly annoying but manageable. He had dealt with civilians during various ceremonies and public events. The tourists were followed by a group of university students who seemed to view provoking the guards as an entertaining challenge. They stood directly in front of Mitchell, making faces, telling jokes, and generally attempting to elicit any kind of response. Mitchell gritted his teeth and focused on maintaining his composure, though he could feel his irritation building. After 45 minutes, Mitchell was beginning to understand why Thompson had called this a discipline test. His legs were starting to ache, his back was getting stiff, and the constant chatter and provocation from the mock tourists was wearing on his nerves. When he glanced sideways at Thompson, he saw a man who appeared to be made of stone, perfectly still, completely focused, showing no signs of fatigue or annoyance despite the identical circumstances. The real test began in the second hour when the distractions became more intense and personal. A group of protesters arrived with signs and megaphones, shouting political slogans and attempting to engage the guards in debate about various military actions. They stood close enough that Mitchell could feel their breath on his face as they shouted. One protester, a young woman with particularly strong opinions about American foreign policy, positioned herself directly in front of Mitchell and began a detailed critique of U.S. military actions in Afghanistan. Her words were chosen specifically to provoke a response, touching on events and decisions that she couldn't possibly know were part of Mitchell's personal combat history. Mitchell felt his heart rate increase and his jaw clench involuntarily. The woman's words were inaccurate and inflammatory, attacking not just policy decisions, but the character and motivations of soldiers like himself. Every instinct told him to respond, to correct her misconceptions, to defend himself and his fellow soldiers. The urge to speak, to move, to react in some way was becoming overwhelming. Through it all, Thompson and his colleagues remained absolutely motionless. They showed no reaction to personal insults, political attacks, or attempts at physical provocation. Their breathing remained steady, their expressions neutral, their posture perfect. They had achieved a level of mental control that Mitchell was beginning to realize he had never approached. By the 90-minute mark, Mitchell was struggling in ways that had nothing to do with physical discomfort. The mental effort required to maintain complete composure while being subjected to deliberate provocation was unlike anything he had experienced. In combat, he had been able to channel stress and anger into action. Here, the discipline required was to channel everything into perfect stillness. His respect for what the guards accomplished daily was growing with each minute. This wasn't just standing around looking decorative. This was a form of mental and physical control that required enormous strength and training. The tourists, protesters, and various other distractions weren't just mild annoyances. They were genuine tests of a soldier's ability to maintain professional composure under extremely trying circumstances. With 10 minutes remaining in the exercise, Mitchell felt himself beginning to crack. A particularly obnoxious group of teenagers had arrived and were attempting to provoke reactions through increasingly inappropriate means. One of them was making crude comments about Mitchell's appearance and speculating loudly about his intelligence and military competence. Mitchell's hands began to clench involuntarily. His breathing became less controlled, and he could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. The effort to remain still was consuming enormous mental energy, and he was beginning to understand why Thompson had described this as requiring years of training to master. Thompson, standing 3 feet to Mitchell's left, remained perfectly composed throughout everything. His breathing was steady, his expression unchanged, his posture flawless. Whatever internal process he was using to maintain this level of discipline was clearly far more sophisticated than anything Mitchell had developed during his military career. When Thompson finally called an end to the exercise, Mitchell nearly staggered as he relaxed his posture. The physical relief was immediate, but the mental exhaustion was profound. He felt as though he had been through an intense combat engagement, despite having done nothing but stand still for 2 hours. Thompson turned to him with the same neutral expression he had maintained throughout the exercise. "How did you find that, Captain?" Mitchell took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. "That was much more difficult than I expected. I had no idea that kind of provocation was part of your regular duties." "Every day," Thompson replied simply. "Tourists, protesters, people with various agendas who see us as symbols rather than individual soldiers. The discipline required is to maintain perfect professionalism regardless of what's said or done to provoke us." Mitchell looked at the other guards who were now relaxing but still maintained their formal bearing. "How do you do it? What's the mental technique?" Thompson's answer would prove to be the most important lesson of Mitchell's military career. "It's not a technique, Captain. It's a fundamental restructuring of how you think about duty, discipline, and what it means to serve something larger than yourself." That evening, Mitchell sat in the officers' mess with Lieutenant Chen, pushing food around his plate without much appetite. The day's experiences had left him mentally drained in a way that was entirely unfamiliar. Combat operations, even the most intense firefights, had never affected him like this. "You look like you've been through hell," Chen observed, setting down her coffee cup. "How did your day with the guards go?" Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, trying to find words for something he wasn't sure he fully understood yet. "It didn't go the way I expected." Chen waited for him to continue, recognizing that something significant had happened to her normally confident colleague. "I think I made some assumptions about what they do," Mitchell continued slowly. "About what ceremonial duty means, about what kind of discipline it requires. I was wrong about pretty much everything." The admission was difficult for Mitchell, who had built his identity around being right about military matters. Chen leaned forward, intrigued by this unexpected humility from someone she had never seen back down from a position. "What happened?" Mitchell described the day's events, from the precision drill that had proved impossible to master, to the tactical exercises that required a different kind of thinking, to the endurance test that had pushed him to his mental limits. As he talked, Chen began to understand that her colleague had encountered something that had fundamentally challenged his understanding of what military excellence looked like. "The thing that gets me," Mitchell said, staring at his untouched dinner, "is that I spent years developing what I thought was excellent military discipline. Combat discipline, leadership under pressure, physical conditioning, tactical thinking, and today I discovered there's this whole other level that I never even knew existed." Chen nodded thoughtfully. "What do you mean?" Mitchell struggled to articulate what he had experienced. "It's like, okay, in combat, you use discipline to channel your energy and aggression and fear into effective action. You stay focused, make good decisions, execute your mission. But what these guys do is different. They use discipline to completely suppress their individual responses in service of something larger." The conversation was interrupted by Thompson's arrival at their table. He was now in casual civilian clothes, but his bearing remained unmistakably military. "Captain Mitchell, Lieutenant Chen," Thompson said with a slight nod. "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to check on how you were processing today's exercises." Mitchell gestured to an empty chair. "Please sit down, and call me James. I think we're past the formal stage after today." Thompson sat with the same measured precision he brought to everything else. "I thought you might have questions about what you experienced?" Mitchell laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I have about 1,000 questions, starting with how someone develops that level of mental control." Thompson's expression softened slightly, showing the first hint of something beyond professional courtesy. "It's not natural for most people. It certainly wasn't for me when I started. The training is designed to systematically break down your normal responses and rebuild them according to different principles." "What kind of principles?" Chen asked, clearly fascinated by the conversation. Thompson considered his words carefully. "Individual excellence in service of collective perfection. Most military training focuses on making you a better individual soldier, stronger, faster, smarter, more capable. Guards training focuses on making you disappear as an individual, so that the unit can achieve something that no individual could accomplish alone." Mitchell frowned. "That sounds almost like giving up your personality." "Not giving up," Thompson corrected. "Channeling. Every guard brings their individual capabilities to the unit, but those capabilities are completely subordinated to the collective mission. When I'm on duty at the palace, I'm not William Thompson making individual decisions about how to respond to situations. I'm one component of the guards, executing our collective responsibility with perfect precision." The explanation struck Mitchell as almost philosophical, far removed from the practical military thinking he was accustomed to. "But how does that make you more effective as soldiers?" Thompson's answer revealed the depth of thought behind the guards' approach. "Because it creates a type of reliability that individual excellence can't match. In combat, Individual soldiers make decisions based on their training, experience, and judgment. Most of the time, those decisions are good. But sometimes they're wrong, and people die because of individual mistakes. He paused, his expression growing more serious. Guards training creates soldiers who don't make individual decisions in the traditional sense. We execute collective judgments with mechanical precision. There's no variability, no chance that someone will have an off day or make a bad choice under pressure. The unit functions as a single organism with multiple parts. Chen leaned forward. That sounds incredibly difficult to achieve. It is, Thompson agreed. The failure rate in guards training is very high. Most soldiers can't surrender that much. Individual autonomy? Even temporarily. It requires a complete reconstruction of how you think about yourself in relation to your duty. Mitchell was beginning to understand why his day had been so challenging. So when I was trying to adapt and modify the tactical exercises based on my individual assessment of the situation, you were working against the system rather than within it, Thompson finished. Your instincts were good, but they were individual instincts in a context that required collective precision. The conversation continued for another hour, with Thompson patiently explaining concepts that challenged everything Mitchell thought he knew about military service. The guards weren't just ceremonial soldiers who happened to also do combat training. They were combat soldiers who had developed a form of discipline so advanced that ceremonial duties were simply one application of their capabilities. As the evening wound down, Thompson made an offer that surprised both American officers. James, if you're interested, I could arrange for you to observe some of our advanced training. Not as a participant. That would require months of preparation. But as an observer. It might help you understand how these principles apply in different contexts. Mitchell didn't hesitate. I'd be very interested in that. Thompson nodded. I'll make the arrangements. But I should warn you, what you'll see might challenge some of your fundamental assumptions about military service. After Thompson left, Mitchell and Chen sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Chen spoke. You know, James, I don't think I've ever seen you this briefly. The advanced training facility that Thompson led Mitchell to the next morning was unlike anything the American officer had seen before. Located in a classified section of the Guards Depot, it consisted of multiple training environments designed to push the boundaries of human discipline and coordination. What you're about to observe, Thompson explained as they walked through security checkpoints, represents the culmination of everything we've discussed. These exercises are used to maintain the highest levels of collective precision under extreme conditions. Mitchell followed Thompson into an observation area overlooking a complex training scenario. Below them, 12 guards were conducting what appeared to be a hostage rescue simulation, but with a level of coordination that defied belief. Every movement was synchronized to the second, every action predetermined and executed with mechanical precision. They're not communicating at all, Mitchell observed, watching the silent figures move through the scenario. Verbal communication becomes unnecessary when collective discipline reaches this level, Thompson replied. Each team member knows exactly what every other team member will do at every moment. The simulation can be completed with zero individual decisions and zero adaptations to circumstances. Mitchell watched in fascination as the guards encountered obstacles and complications that would normally require tactical adjustments. Instead of adapting, they executed predetermined responses that had been practiced until they became automatic. When one team member was wounded in the simulation, the others didn't assess the situation or improvise solutions. They smoothly transitioned to a backup plan that everyone knew perfectly. But what if the circumstances don't match any of your predetermined responses? Mitchell asked. Thompson's answer revealed the true depth of their training philosophy. We practice enough scenarios that we have predetermined responses for virtually any situation. The goal isn't to think our way through problems, it's to have already thought through every possible problem and trained the perfect response. The TE demonstration continued for 2 hours, with different teams conducting increasingly complex scenarios. Mitchell watched guards coordinate responses to terrorist attacks, natural disasters, and civil emergencies with the same mechanical precision they brought to ceremonial duties. In every case, individual initiative was subordinated to collective execution of practiced responses. The most impressive demonstration came last. A team of 6 guards was placed in a scenario designed to test their ability to maintain collective discipline while under extreme stress. They were subjected to simulated combat conditions, including live fire exercises, explosive sounds, smoke, and physical obstacles, while executing a complex mission that required perfect timing and coordination. Throughout the exercise, the guards maintained the same level of precision Mitchell had observed during ceremonial duties. Their breathing remained controlled, their movements exact, their coordination flawless. The chaos and stress that would normally disrupt human performance had no effect on their execution. "How is that possible?" Mitchell asked, genuinely amazed by what he was witnessing. "Years of training to completely separate emotional and physical responses from mission execution," Thompson explained. "Fear, stress, fatigue, pain, these become irrelevant to performance when collective discipline reaches this level." As the final exercise concluded, Thompson led Mitchell down to meet the participating guards. Up close, Mitchell could see that they had been through an intense physical and mental challenge. They were sweating, breathing hard, and showed signs of fatigue. But their bearing remained perfect, their responses measured and professional. "Gentlemen," Thompson said, "Captain Mitchell has some questions about today's exercises." Mitchell found himself at a loss for words. What he had witnessed went beyond impressive military performance into something approaching the superhuman. "I'm not sure what to ask," he admitted. "What you've accomplished seems to go beyond normal human capabilities." Sergeant Phillips, whom Mitchell recognized from the first day's exercises, responded with characteristic understatement. "It's simply the result of proper training, sir. Nothing that any disciplined soldier couldn't achieve with sufficient preparation." The response was typical of what Mitchell had come to expect from the guards. Extraordinary capability delivered with matter-of-fact professionalism. They genuinely didn't seem to understand that what they had achieved was remarkable. Over lunch, Thompson and Mitchell had their most serious conversation about the implications of what Mitchell had observed. "I need to ask you something," Mitchell said, setting down his coffee cup. "Are you still human when you're performing at that level? Or have you become something else?" Thompson considered the question carefully. "That's probably the most important question anyone can ask about our training. The answer is that we become more human, not less. We develop capabilities that most people never realize they possess." Mitchell frowned. "But you've eliminated individual judgment, personal response, even basic self-preservation instincts. How is that more human?" "Because," Thompson replied, "we've learned to channel all of those human capabilities toward a single, perfect purpose. Instead of scattering our energy across dozens of individual impulses and reactions, we focus everything toward collective excellence." The philosophical implications were staggering to Mitchell. "So you're saying that individual freedom and personal expression are actually limitations?" "In certain contexts, yes," Thompson said without hesitation. "Individual freedom is valuable, in many circumstances. But when lives depend on perfect execution, individual freedom becomes a luxury that can cost people their lives." Mitchell spent the rest of the afternoon walking through London, trying to process what he had experienced over the past 3 days. His entire understanding of military excellence had been challenged and largely overturned. The confident American officer who had dismissed ceremonial guards as parade soldiers had discovered a form of military discipline that surpassed anything in his experience. That evening, as he prepared his report for his superiors, Mitchell struggled with how to convey what he had learned. The guards had demonstrated capabilities that would be difficult for other military officers to believe without witnessing them personally. More importantly, they had revealed philosophical approaches to military service that challenged fundamental American assumptions about individual initiative and leadership. When Lieutenant Chen found him in the common room later that night, she immediately noticed the change in his demeanor. "You look like someone who's had his world turned upside down," she observed. Mitchell nodded slowly. "I think that's exactly what happened. Everything I thought I knew about military discipline, about what makes an effective soldier, about the relationship between individual excellence and unit effectiveness, it was all incomplete." "So what are you going to do with that knowledge?" Chen asked. Mitchell's answer surprised even himself. "I'm going to completely rethink how I approach leadership and training when I get back home. The guards have shown me that there are levels of military effectiveness I never imagined possible." 3 days later, as Mitchell prepared to leave London, Thompson met him at the airport for a final conversation. "What will you tell your colleagues about your experience here?" Thompson asked. Mitchell considered the question. "The truth. That I came here thinking I understood military discipline, and I learned that I didn't understand the first thing about it. That ceremonial soldiers aren't performers in fancy uniforms. They're some of the most disciplined and effective military personnel in the world." Thompson's expression showed the first genuine smile Mitchell had seen from him. "And what will you do with that knowledge?" "Try to become worthy of it," Mitchell replied. "Try to develop the kind of discipline you've shown me is possible." As Mitchell boarded his flight back to the United States, he carried with him more than just memories of an educational exchange. He carried a fundamentally changed understanding of what it meant to serve, what discipline could accomplish, and what heights of military excellence were possible when individual soldiers learned to subordinate themselves completely to something larger than their own capabilities. The confident American officer who had challenged the Royal Guard had learned the true meaning of discipline, not through defeat or humiliation, but through witnessing a form of human excellence he had never imagined possible.